I'd always thought that my friendship with Michael was one of the most stable and uncomplicated things in my life. We met back in college, both sharing an interest in technology and gaming. Over the years, I became a frequent guest at his house in a quiet suburb of Seattle. His mother, Sarah, was always a gracious host. If I once saw her as simply a caring woman, I was now beginning to notice something more about her. Her charm, confidence, and gentle smile created an aura that was hard to look away from. That day, I unexpectedly had some free time and decided to drop by Michael's place unannounced. It was chilly outside and the gray sky threatened rain, but I paid it no mind. I parked my car by the house and headed for the door where Sarah greeted me. She looked as stunning as ever. A simple white blouse and jeans accentuated her graceful figure, and the faint scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air. "Alec, what a pleasant surprise," she said, smiling. "Michael's not home right now. He went to the city to pick up a few things." "Oh," I replied, slightly embarrassed. "I thought we could spend some time together." She nodded and opened the door wide. "Well, since you're here, come in. I won't leave you outside with a storm coming." I stepped into the house, feeling a bit uneasy at her friendly yet somehow more attentive gaze. Sarah led me to the living room where a soft couch waited, and on the table were a newspaper and a half-finished cup of tea. "Tea or coffee?" she asked, as if it were second nature to her to host guests. "Tea, if it's not too much trouble," I replied, trying to keep my cool. When Sarah returned with the tea, the rain had already started to drum against the windows. Her voice was soft, like the rustling of leaves. "It seems the rain has really settled in. Looks like you'll be waiting here for a while." I nodded, but strangely I felt a sense of relief. We began to talk. First it was about work, then the little things of daily life. Sarah laughed at my stories of office life, her smile warm and almost contagious. "You've always been so smart, Alec," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Michael used to tell me how you helped him with his college projects." "Yeah, back then he could still pay me in pizza for my help," I joked, making her laugh again. But soon the conversation took a more serious turn. Sarah spoke about the time she spent alone and how, despite her busy life, it sometimes felt stagnant. Her openness caught me off guard, but I sensed she wasn't sharing this for no reason. "Sometimes it feels like no one even notices me," she said, looking thoughtfully into her cup. I wanted to say something, but at that moment, a loud clap of thunder made us both jump. Sarah smiled as she stood. "It looks like the power might go out. I should check the flashlights," she said, leaving for the hallway. I remained in the living room, feeling a slight tension. The rain intensified, casting the house into a muted half-light. When Sarah returned, her face looked pensive. "You know, I always appreciate when someone does what they feel is right," she said, sitting across from me again. Her gaze lingered on me a little longer than usual, and for a moment the room was so quiet that only the sound of the rain could be heard outside. It was in that moment that I realized this evening would be nothing like I'd expected. The sound of rain against the windows was gradually fading. Yet instead of feeling calm, I sensed a strange tension building up. Sarah sat across from me, legs crossed at the edge of the couch, her posture graceful like that of a seasoned actress who knows exactly how to capture the audience's attention. I tried to focus on the conversation, but every gesture, every glance, threw me off balance. "Alec," she said with a gentle smile, squinting her eyes slightly, "how often do you allow yourself to truly relax?" "Probably not as often as I should," I answered, trying to mask my unease. She chuckled, as if reading my mind. "You always seem so put together. You know, it's both impressive and intriguing." Sarah rose from the couch, her movements fluid, almost feline. She walked over to the window, watching the raindrops trickle down the glass. "You know, I've always liked how the rain cleanses everything," she said, turning to look at me, "as if afterward you can start over." I didn't know how to respond. Her words seemed to carry a deeper meaning beyond a casual comment on the weather. She took a step closer and pointed to a book lying on the shelf beside me. "Have you ever read this?" I turned to pick up the book. It was an old collection of Robert Frost's poetry, worn, with notes scribbled in the margins. Yes, a little. Michael never really cared for poetry, I think. You must have been the one who inspired him to at least pretend he enjoyed literature. Her laughter was soft and easy. Perhaps. But you know, it's rare in this house to find someone who genuinely wants to talk about anything deep. She returned to the couch, sitting closer this time, less than a meter between us. The air in the room seemed thicker. Alec, do you ever feel like you're missing something important? She asked, her eyes fixed on mine. Her question caught me off guard. Yes, sometimes, I answered quietly. And what do you do when you feel that way? Sarah leaned in slightly, her voice barely audible. To be honest, I don't know. I guess I just try to focus on what I have. Her gaze turned more serious, almost contemplative. Slowly, she extended her hand, and I felt her fingers gently touch my hand. It was so unexpected that I froze for a moment. That's a good answer, she whispered. But sometimes, Alec, what we already have is just an excuse not to move forward. My thoughts were swirling. Her words felt like a challenge, as though she were urging me to something. I looked into her eyes and time seemed to stop. You've always been so straightforward, she added, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know who made the first move. Suddenly we were closer than could be explained. Her hand touched my face, her fingers brushing a strand of hair from my forehead. I could feel her breath, hear the rain outside, and it seemed, even my heartbeat, when our lips met. It was gentle, as though she was testing if this was right. The kiss lasted only a moment, but left an endless swirl of emotions in its wake. We both paused, realizing we'd crossed a line, but neither of us made an attempt to step back. Sarah, I began, but the word stuck in my throat. She smiled slightly, her eyes filled with warmth mixed with a hint of sadness. You're a good person, Alec, she said softly, standing up from the couch. And now I need to check if the porch is wet. And she left, leaving me in the room with thoughts I couldn't quite piece together. When I heard Sarah close the terrace door, I realized I needed to calm my thoughts. The entire situation seemed surreal. Her words, her gaze, that kiss. I sat on the couch, staring at the floor as if I could find answers in the patterns of the carpet. Outside, the rain continued to pour down, the rhythmic sound of raindrops the only thing anchoring me back to reality. I decided it would be better to distract myself and got up to look at the photos on the mantel. They were family photos. Sarah and Michael, young and grinning, and beside him a tall man, presumably his father. Then I noticed that in some of the photos, Sarah was alone. The subtle sadness in her eyes in those photos seemed to reveal years that were perhaps not as happy as she let on. Do you enjoy looking at old photos? Her voice made me jump. I turned and saw her standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame. In her hands was a cup of tea, steam softly curling upwards. They say more than one might think, I said, pointing to a picture. You have a wonderful family. She stepped closer, standing beside me, her gaze passing over the photos and resting on one in particular. This was taken a year before everything changed, she said, nodding at a photo of her and Michael on the beach. We'd gone to California. I remember he convinced me to try water skiing. I'd never laughed so hard. Her voice was warm, but tinged with a slight nostalgia. She turned to me, her eyes meeting mine, and I felt the tension between us filling the room once again. Alec, why are you always so serious? She suddenly asked, a slight smile playing on her lips. You're still young. You should carry some lightness with you. I laughed to hide my embarrassment. Maybe because I'm trying to be an adult? I shrugged, though sometimes it clearly doesn't work. Her smile widened. Sometimes being an adult means allowing yourself to be vulnerable, she said, her voice soft yet certain. These words stayed in my mind as if they weren't just advice, but a hidden challenge. Sarah took a step back, as though inviting me to follow her. Come on, she said. Let's make sure the guest room is ready. We went upstairs, and I suddenly noticed how quiet the house was. The sound of the rain was muted, and each step on the wooden floor seemed louder than it should. Sarah opened the door to the room where I was to stay the night. It's been a while since I've prepared this room, she admitted as we walked in. I hope it's still in order. I followed her, taking in the simple but cozy bedroom. The bed was made with a white bedspread, a nightstand with a small lamp beside it. Sarah leaned over to straighten the pillows, and in that moment, everything that had happened earlier flooded over me. "Sarah," I began, and she turned to me, surprised. For a moment, we just looked at each other. Her confident expression shifted to something else. Expectation mixed with doubt. It was a moment that could go either way. It's hard to explain, but I feel I stopped, unsure how to continue. "There's no need to explain, Alec," she interrupted softly, and before I knew what was happening, she took a step forward. I felt her hand gently touch my cheek. It was so unexpected that I froze. But as her gaze met mine, I knew I couldn't back away now. We drew closer, and our lips met again. But this time there was no hesitation. This kiss was slow, warm, and deep, as though each of us was trying to convey something the words couldn't express. When she pulled back, her eyes searched mine. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" she whispered. I nodded, and instead of speaking, I pulled her closer, feeling as if the walls of the small bedroom were becoming our own world. The next morning, I woke to the sound of thunder. The light outside the window was dim, and the rain continued to tap lazily against the roof. First, I didn't recognize where I was, until I saw the familiar white bedspread in the guest room Sarah had shown me the night before. Memories from the previous night flooded back. Her words, her touch, that moment that had changed everything. I felt both exhilarated and empty. Sarah wasn't in the room. I sat up trying to clear my head. The clock on the wall showed it was 7 in the morning. From downstairs, I heard the faint sound of the radio and the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the air. I dressed quickly and headed down, still sorting through the confusion of my thoughts. She stood by the kitchen counter, carefully pouring coffee into 2 mugs. She wore a soft gray sweater looking calm, as if the night that had turned our lives upside down had only been a dream. "Good morning," she said with a gentle smile as she noticed me. "Did you sleep well?" I nodded, stepping closer. Her voice was as calm as ever, but I noticed a subtle unease in her movements. We hadn't spoken about what had happened, and everything that hung between us felt like an invisible knot neither of us knew how to untie. "Sarah," I started, but she raised a hand, stopping me. "Let's just have breakfast," she said with a slight sigh. "There's still time to talk." She set a cup of coffee in front of me, and we sat down at the table. First, we spoke about neutral things. The rainy morning, how difficult it was to get used to Seattle's chilly summers. But I could see her mind was far away, and I couldn't shake the heaviness in my own chest. Just then, a knock at the door broke the silence. My stomach twisted as I heard a familiar voice call out, "Mom, are you home?" Sarah froze for a moment. We exchanged glances, and I knew I had to do something. "In the living room," she called, quickly standing up. She walked to the door, her expression calm, but I could sense the tension in her face. I heard Michael's voice as he spoke. "I thought you'd still be asleep. I decided to stop by early. The rain passed through the city center anyway." I stood up, taking my cup with me. Hiding wasn't an option. If Michael saw me, it would at least seem normal. I walked into the living room, trying to appear as relaxed as possible. "Alec?" Michael looked surprised. "What are you doing here?" "I stopped by yesterday, but you weren't home." Sarah suggested I wait out the storm, and it didn't let up. I replied, doing my best to sound natural. He seemed to believe me. Michael laughed and clapped me on the shoulder. "Great. I hope you didn't eat all of Mom's homemade bread." The 3 of us returned to the kitchen, and Sarah quickly poured him some coffee. Michael suspected nothing. He started talking about his trip, cracking jokes and behaving as he always did. But every time Sarah and I exchanged glances, I felt the tension thickening in the space around us. When Michael got distracted scrolling through his phone, Sarah looked at me and whispered almost inaudibly, "We need to talk about this later." I nodded. Her words felt like a promise or perhaps a warning. After breakfast, Michael announced that he wanted to go to the store and invited me along. I couldn't refuse. On one hand, it gave me a reason to leave the house. On the other, It left everything unresolved. We stepped out into the rain, and I looked back at the house. Sarah was standing by the window watching us, and in her gaze I saw something I couldn't quite define. A mix of sadness, gratitude, and perhaps fear. It was damp and cold outside, but inside me emotions still raged. I knew that one day I would have to make a choice, but at that moment, reality was pushing that decision aside. Michael talked about trivial things, and I tried to listen, thinking only of what was happening between me and his mother. That day, I realized that the previous night had opened a new chapter in my life. But I also knew that every step from now on would come with difficult questions. And the answers to those questions could change everything.